last but not least, last speaker of this session is Chelsea from MIT, and she will talk to us about interventions over predictions.
Great. Hi, y'all. I'm Chelsea. I'm super happy and honored to be here to present this work to you guys, and particularly on behalf of my co-authors, two of whom are here, Karthik, Dinakar, and Madars, Virza. Can you guys raise your hands just so people can identify you back there and up here? So our paper is called Interventions over Predictions, and what we're really trying to do in this work is reframe the ethical debate around the use of actuarial risk assessments in the criminal justice system. And in particular, we've been focusing on the use of pre-trial risk assessments, where we've seen the prevailing framing being around the question of whether or not we can actually develop fair and accurate tools for prediction based on biased historical data. And in our paper, so what we try to do is really challenge this prevailing framing and offer a new way to think about what the stakes are when we're thinking about this issue. So just by way of background, today, 1 in 5 people who are currently behind bars in the United States have not been convicted of a crime. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen a really significant expansion, particularly in our jail population. 95% of that expansion is estimated to be in the pretrial detainee population. Now, these are people who, by and large, haven't been charged with a serious crime, but really are people who lack the resources to be able to post the bail necessary for them to be released. So in response to this trend, what we've seen is that pretrial advocates, reform advocates, have been pushing to use risk rather than wealth as one of the main determinants for release. And to that end, risk assessments have been framed as this more fair and objective means of evaluating and making forecasts about things such as a defendant's likelihood to fail to appear in court, or their likelihood of posing a danger to the community if released. However, in 2016, as probably everybody in this room knows, this narrative was called into question when ProPublica published a report of an audit of the COMPAS tool, which is one of the prevailing risk assessment tools that's used in this country today. And they argued that COMPAS was not only not very accurate, but the burden of that inaccuracy fell disproportionately on the shoulders of African American defendants, who were almost twice as likely to be rated as high risk, but not go on to reoffend. So this report sparked a flurry of debate, much of which is focused on asking a question around what types of data are appropriate or fair to incorporate in these evaluations of risk, but also around the inherent trade-offs that we've got to consider when designing a tool for prediction based on imperfect data. We argue, though, that this framing is inherently limited because it focuses specifically and narrowly on the development of the tool itself, rather than kind of zooming out and thinking about how risk assessments are a part of a larger assemblage of practices that drive outcomes in the criminal justice system. Many of these arguments are built on kind of the shaky assumptions that were initially put forth by the proponents of risk assessments, who characterize assessments as essentially these tools for prediction that are disconnected from interventions. However, though, it's really important for us to really recognize that predictions aren't made in a vacuum. They're acted upon in really important ways that have consequences for the people who are assessed. So, to understand the full ethical implications of these tools, we really have to zoom out and look at them in context. And that means asking better questions about how risk assessments operate discursively as ways of rationalizing and naturalizing certain modes of thinking about defendants and interacting with them before their trial date. So to that end, we'd like to put forth a few other questions that we think would be really useful in grounding this debate around the ethics of these tools. Namely, how have risk assessments evolved over time to support a wide range of institutional goals and organizational logics? Secondly, how is the risky subject constructed in these tools? Or in other words, what are the implicit theories of criminality that are reflected in the risk factors that are incorporated into them? And then finally, how do the methods, specifically the statistical methods, shape the way that risk is understood and ultimately acted upon in these situations? So, to answer these questions, we've got to look back in history. While pretrial risk assessments are a fairly new phenomenon, actuarial risk assessments have been around for a long time in the criminal justice system and have been used to inform a wide range of decisions ranging from sentencing to probation and bail. And probation. So the first generation of these tools really came around in the 1920s, and they didn't use any sort of statistical mechanism to validate the models. They really were semi-structured clinical tools that were used by clinical experts of various sorts to identify effective rehabilitative treatment options for offenders. These tools didn't come into under criticism really until the 1970s, and people who weren't a big fan of them were saying, hey, these tools, they're too subjective, and really they're not that accurate at prediction. This was during a time when there was a broader shift in thinking around the role of rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. And there were a lot of people who were pushing to narrow the set of interventions that were made available to offenders. And incapacitation was seen as the primary and most pragmatic means of reducing the risk of recidivism. So as such, the goals of risk assessment really changed and shifted towards a prediction-oriented kind of goal. And so to that end, a new statistical technique at the time, regression modeling, was introduced into the picture to help identify the risk factors that were the most predictive of recidivism over time. So using regression, what happened was we pared down the set of risk factors that were considered mostly to a set of static historical factors, things like prior criminal history. And through these changes, risk, the very notion of risk, was reconstituted as this static phenomenon, something that we couldn't easily change or intervene upon beyond incapacitation. It's also worth noting that these changes were a part of a larger suite of policies that were being introduced in the early 70s, like mandatory sentencing guidelines. These were called quote-unquote colorblind policies that ostensibly were intended to standardize decision-making and reduce implicit bias, which is a framing we're still hearing a lot about today. But there's been a growing body of academic literature that's connected these policies to the increases in incarceration rates that we've seen in the subsequent decades, and even more worrisomely, the increasing racial disparity in those rates. So it wasn't until the 80s that the third generation of risk assessment came into being, and effectively reconstituted risk as this dynamic thing by reintegrating in some dynamic risk needs factors. These were things like employment status, things that could be changed through services or various other types of interventions. These risk assessments were further augmented in the 90s with the fourth generation of tools, which incorporated this concept of responsivity factors. These were things like self-esteem levels and IQ, which were seen as things that could shape the response to different kinds of treatment options for individuals. So while these third and fourth generation tools shifted the pendulum back towards an interventionist sort of mindset when it came to these tools, it's really worth kind of digging in and asking questions about what types of, how the factors shaped the way we understood risk. What were the theories that were informing this notion of risk, and how was that connected to treatment options that were available? So the vast majority of those dynamic risk factors were drawn from psychosocial theories of criminal behavior, which essentially characterize criminal behavior as the byproduct of internalized antisocial habits and beliefs. So what this does, though, it frames intervention primarily in terms of the individual and kind of precludes broader structural considerations about what might be driving crime. And this, I think more importantly, also limits our ability to kind of understand things like the population level differences in outcomes and arrest rates, because we're hyper-focusing at the individual level in these tools. So the narrow theoretical focus of these risk assessments stems in part from the statistical methods that are used to develop these tools. So by and large today, the vast majority of risk assessments are still based on regression modeling, which is really ill-suited to test and differentiate between competing theories of criminal behavior. Regression is best used for identifying a set of variables which are predictive of a given outcome. But those variables are correlational at their core, not causal. So for example, like we mentioned before, prior criminal history, very predictive of future arrest, but doesn't help you understand anything about the causal mechanisms of that future crime. So what we've seen is, even as the goals of risk assessment have evolved back towards intervention, the statistical methods underlying them are fundamentally predictive at their core. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence in interest in thinking about risk assessments primarily for prediction, especially at the pretrial stage, where release decisions are in the mass media characterized as essentially this task of forecasting. We would argue, though, that pretrial release is actually a critical point of intervention. For example, cash bail is an intervention that we know is not only ineffective, but extremely punitive because it denies people one of their most basic rights, the right to liberty under the presumption of innocence. Now, as risk assessments have become a vehicle for bail reform, we've seen the expansion, and cash bail is scaled back. We've seen the expansion of other types of non-monetary conditioning practices, things like electronic monitoring and mandatory drug testing. Yet, regression-based risk assessments are very ill-equipped to help judges think about whether or not these new types of conditions are actually effective at lowering the risks that they care about. So as a result, something we're very concerned about is that we run the risk of simply displacing the punitive costs of cash bail onto other types of practices, because we still have this critical gap between the predictions that are made and the interventions that follow. These challenges are likely to be exacerbated as the enthusiasm grows around the idea of using machine learning to augment the predictive capacity of these tools. By and large, machine learning leverages a lot of the same core concepts as regression, but does so by expanding the set of covariates we could actually consider. And the proponents of machine learning in these situations really hold prediction as kind of this sacrosanct goal, which I think is best reflected in the comments of people like Dr. Richard Burke, who's a professor in Pennsylvania. This is him at a conference a few years ago where he said, "I'm not trying to explain criminal behavior, I'm trying to forecast it. If shoe size or sunspots predicts that a person's gonna commit a homicide, I want to use that information, even if I have no idea how it works." Now, this way of thinking has direct implications for how we understand risk and quote-unquote risky people. Dr. Burke goes on to say, crimes committed earlier in life are much more predictive of future problems than crimes committed later in life. If I committed an armed robbery today as an older person, it doesn't predict anything. If I committed the same armed robbery at 10 years old, you've got a bad guy on your hands. And he's got this slide of, the ultimate, embodiment and symbols of good and evil. Now, I find this rhetoric from Dr. Burke deeply disturbing, because not only does it reassert risk as this static, unintervenable thing, but it has direct implications for how we view the people who are being evaluated. According to Dr. Burke, there are good guys in this world and there are bad guys. And rather than condemning a system which might have placed a 10-year-old boy in a situation where he somehow got involved in an armed robbery, he condemns the boy himself. So he effectively offloads our collective responsibility as society onto the shoulders of a child. In light of these findings, I would argue that predictive risk assessments are best characterized as a new form of algorithmic violence. This isn't my term. This is a term I'm borrowing from Mimi Onuoha. And she defines it as the violence that an algorithm or automated decision-making system inflicts by preventing people from meeting their basic needs. This term is derivative of Galtung's concept of structural violence, which scholars have described as a way of imposing categories that legitimate hierarchy and inequality. Now, in order to break this worrisome trend towards algorithmic violence in these prediction-oriented tools, my co-authors and I argue that pretrial risk assessments should shift towards a causal inference framework for evaluating criminogenic risks and needs. In contrast to regression and machine learning, causal inference is a framework that's used to establish causal relationships between covariates and the outcome variable of interest. And this is achieved often through experimental designs in which covariates are systematically altered to surface those effects. But I think most importantly, for us, causal inference enables us to ask a fundamentally different set of questions, and better questions. Questions around the structural drivers of crime, questions around the population-level differences between outcomes in the criminal justice system, rather than always focusing on inter-individual variation amongst the arrested population. And I guess most broadly, asking questions about how this system works so that we can improve it, rather than always asking how individuals are performing in the system we're currently living in. Thank you.
Thanks for that really amazing presentation. It adds a narrative that is missing, that comes up when you talk to risk assessment modelers inside justice ministries, that they know this is the history of these systems that's not emphasized. One thing that I wanted to ask you, when I've been interviewing people in Europe who work on these systems within justice ministries and so on, mostly they use them for course allocation within prisons and things like that. They are worried that they are being pressured to make risk models for serious offenses, and they know that's not methodologically sound. Could you talk very briefly to the trend, if you know anything about that in relation to serious risk modeling of really very violent, rare events?
Yeah, it is tough to model things like violent crime because there are less of them. I think it's also a really interesting example, though, also of where we've seen, just fundamentally different assumptions really shape the types of interventions we think about. So, for example, there are a bunch of, epidemiologists who've also reframed violent crime as a public health issue. And when you base your interventions out of your human services departments as opposed to your police department, you can get striking reductions in violent crime in communities. So I think this comes back to what, the deeper question of what the role of the criminal justice system is, and whether or not it ultimately is about preventing crimes in the future or punishing people who deserve it. Thanks.
Hi, sorry, Michael's taller than me. Hold on. Okay, that's better. Hi, thank you so much, Chelsea. That was just an absolutely killer talk. And
Thanks.
It was amazing, and I really, yeah, you can do it. Thank you. And to me, that's the best of what the point of this conference is putting the technical tools in historical and social context. But I have one question for you about kind of the implications of your findings, that if causal inference tools are the way to go, and you mentioned oftentimes experimental methods are the way that we test causal mechanisms. Can you reflect a little bit on kind of what that means or what the ethics of such experimentation might be in this context?
Definitely, and this is something we've been talking about as our team a lot, because we also want to make sure we avoid now posing causal inference as the new silver bullet solution of this stuff, right? And we were just having a great talk a couple of days ago at Columbia with a guy named Seth Prinz, who's written a great paper. Do you remember the name of it? It's basically asking this question of whether or not causal inference can be used to address structural, deep upstream issues rather than just proximate interventions that really don't get the bigger picture. And his main argument is that, yes, you can, but to do that, you have to actually steer away from just looking and testing interventions and really asking about causal relationships between structures and outcomes. So that's something we're definitely grappling with. And another thing we're really interested in is also the question of how you can pair quantitative approaches like this with more qualitative work to really get at the deeper why behind a lot of this stuff. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Chelsea.
Hi.
Nice seeing you. So I have a question about, I think, the last slide you did before that. So shift away from prediction to informed intervention. So I have a couple questions about that. One is, so are you talking about the difference sort of in terms of individual interventions or sort of systemic, structural, institutional interventions? And if you are, how do you know who to intervene with if you don't have some sort of predictive tool or some tool that's assessing the risk?
That's a great point, and you might be pointing to an appropriate place where machine learning might be useful in terms of surfacing hypotheses or specific populations that you want to think about investigating more deeply and building an intervention for. I think in terms of informed intervention, the big picture is around asking about interventions to improve outcomes rather than just assuming that the predictions are enough in and of themselves. I think the starting point for us was asking this kind of rhetorical question of if these risk assessments were 100% accurate, would we be okay with them? And that in asking it out loud, we're like, oh, actually that's a trick question because there's no such thing as 100% accurate tool because what we do with that prediction really matters. So that's the key thing I think we're trying to get at there, and I think the question about individuals or structure is yes, both types of interventions. I think the structural ones are going to be perhaps harder, perhaps not. Things like failure to appear are really interesting because there are probably a bunch of structural factors at play and why people don't show up to court that are really under examined right now. So that may be a really interesting area to see work in the future. One more? Okay.
Hi, thanks a lot for your reframing. I guess I had a question about the kinds of informed individual level interventions you mentioned, specifically thinking about how to understand where intervention might be effective. And so regression plays a really important role in even causal inference, like Neyman-Rubin potential outcomes framework, for better leveraging covariates to get better treatment effect estimates. And so I wonder if this brings us back to the original justification for risk assessments in terms of the more efficient deployment of restricted, scarce resources for social programs. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on how to maybe avoid falling into the same trap, even with causal inference, which is informed by regression adjustment.
I'm not sure I caught what the trap was. Could you just say that one more time?
Yeah, I guess with respect to the original justification for risk assessment, being to better identify where to deploy resources that are inherently scarce, one can think of a similar argument for where to deploy positive social programs to better improve outcomes. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on navigating that difficulty about withholding positive interventions.
Yeah, the person who I think talks the best about this right now that I've been listening to is Virginia Eubanks, who talks a lot about how we've used a lot of these automated decision-making things to justify this scarce resources approach instead of really investing in fixing fundamental deep social inequalities. So I would point you to her work and say, yeah, I don't think causal inference is going to fix all of this. I mean, it has to fit into a bigger conversation around what we're willing to invest our resources in down the line. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.